The ban and the buried receipt. The morning sun, usually a welcome golden benediction over the Central Valley, felt like a harsh, metallic spotlight on the day the federal government decided to steal a century of our family's history. My name is Arjun Patel, and my farm, all 60 acres of it, is not just land. It's a living museum, a testament to resilience, held together by generations of sweat and a few stubborn truths. The most important truth was the seed. It was the Patel heritage wheat, or the Desi Gehun as my grandfather called it. This was not the high-yield, water-guzzling, genetically uniform fodder that the megacorporations pushed and the USDA subsidized. My wheat was a quiet warrior. It didn't boast volume, but it guaranteed survival. Where the hybrid strains boasted 6 feet of height and shallow, greedy roots, my Desi Gehun stood a humble 3 feet, channeling its energy downward, sending deep, probing roots 15 feet into the soil to find the ancient water table. It was the only crop in the region that consistently survived the summer droughts that were growing hotter and longer every year. It was our family's insurance, our history, and our most powerful defiance. The disruption arrived not with a thunderclap, but with the grating sound of gravel crunching under the tires of a pristine, white Ford Explorer, a vehicle so clean it looked offensively out of place against the dusty reality of the farm. The driver was Inspector Miller, a local field agent, but the woman in the passenger seat, all sharp suit and severe, corporate haircut, was the one who held the power. She was Dr. Evelyn Reed's protégé, a mid-level bureaucrat named Sarah, and she was holding a clipboard that felt heavier than a plow. "Mr. Patel," Sarah announced, her voice pitched with a condescension usually reserved for explaining basic arithmetic to toddlers. "We are here regarding your crop inventory. Specifically, the non-conforming genetic material you are cultivating on Parcel 4. Non-conforming genetic material. They had reduced my great-grandfather's life work, a strain of wheat that fed my family through the Dust Bowl, to a clinical phrase you'd find on a lab report for mold. The audacity was breathtaking. That material, Miss Sarah, is my family's seed stock. It's been here since 1923, registered under my grandfather's name," I said, trying to keep my voice as steady and low as the deep hum of my old tractor. I wanted her to feel the weight of history in my words, but bureaucrats only understand the weight of paperwork. She handed me the notice. It was a thick, official document, all embossed seals and dense, convoluted legal jargon. The key phrases jumped out like insults: order of obligatory destruction, mitigation of contamination risk, and the killer blow, immediate fine of $12,000 for an authorized crop variety. The justification was the newly introduced USDA Certified Hybrid Registry, a program that, ironically, was supposed to protect the purity of American crops. In reality, it protected the market share of the 3 massive seed corporations that funded Dr. Evelyn Reed's position. My Desi Gehun, which had evolved naturally over centuries to thrive in this specific microclimate, was considered a threat because its genetic diversity could, theoretically, contaminate the sterile, uniform fields of my neighbors, fields that were, incidentally, failing. I felt a familiar, slow burn of righteous anger. The same anger my father felt when a developer tried to pave over the creek on the property line 50 years ago. This was a classic bureaucratic maneuver. Overwhelm the small guy with paperwork, financial pressure, and the threat of legal action, forcing compliance or bankruptcy. They expected me to panic, to immediately plow under the precious wheat to save the money. But they didn't know the Patels. We keep records. My father, who had been a quiet, relentless man, always said, "Arjun, government forgets. Paper remembers." He wasn't talking about tax receipts. He was talking about the evidence that proved our existence predated their rules. I excused myself from the arrogant Inspector Miller and the clipboard-wielding Sarah, who was already discussing lunch plans on her phone. I walked straight to the old shed, the one that smelled of dry hay, old oil, and the sweet, lingering scent of preserved wheat dust. Beneath a workbench, hidden inside a rusted, hinged metal tin that once held my grandfather's smoking tobacco, I found it. The tin contained 2 things: a brittle, yellowed photograph of my grandfather standing proudly next to a massive, horse-drawn plow, and a stack of papers tied with ancient, dry twine. The top document was dated August 12, 1941, stamped with the archaic circular seal of the United States Department of Agriculture, Crop Resilience Initiative. It was a receipt, a handwritten ledger entry, and a formal letter of gratitude addressed to Mr. R. Patel from a high-ranking USDA official in Washington. The letter thanked my grandfather for the generous donation of his unique, deep-rooted Triticum aestivum strain, which was to be used in experimental breeding programs to combat the widespread drought conditions of the 1940s. In exchange, the USDA granted the Patel farm permanent exemption from any future standardization regulations, recognizing the seed status as a vital national genetic reserve. It was the perfect, damning evidence. My seed was not unauthorized. It was the authorized basis for their own historical research. The very agency that was now trying to ban it had, 80 years prior, formally recognized its genetic superiority under stress conditions. I meticulously scanned the entire set of documents, enlarged the 1941 seal and the exemption clause, and printed them on high-quality paper. I then typed a crisp, one-page response to the order of obligatory destruction. The tone was professional, yet laced with the kind of academic condescension that would sting Dr. Reed's office. The Patel farm disputes the imposition of fine number 2024-41C. The material in question is not non-conforming, but is a formally registered and historically documented landrace granted permanent exemption status by the USDA on August 12, 1941. See attached Exhibit A, official receipt and exemption letter. I signed it, placed the printout in a thick manila envelope, and walked back out. Sarah was still outside, tapping impatiently. "Miss Sarah," I said, handing her the envelope. "You can inform Dr. Reed that the fine is invalid, and the order of destruction is cancelled. We were here first. You might want to check the USDA archives under the Great Drought section. The paperwork is there, too." The look on her face, the sudden shift from entitled boredom to panicked recognition, was priceless. This was my first small victory, but I knew this was just the beginning. The small fry were gone, but the big fish, Dr. Evelyn Reed herself, was about to feel personally challenged, and she wouldn't stop until my green fields turned brown, just like her corporate sponsors wanted. The game had officially started. The financial siege and the deep roots. The single-page response I sent back, my grandfather's receipt, framed by my coldly professional legal commentary, didn't just invalidate their fine, it humiliated Dr. Evelyn Reed. The news reached her office in Washington, D.C. not through official channels, but through a panic-stricken text from Sarah. "Patel has an old exemption. 1941. We can't enforce the registry rule." Evelyn Reed was not a woman accustomed to defeat, especially not at the hands of a regional entity she considered agriculturally irrelevant. Her career was built on the sleek, modernist pillars of corporate agriculture: standardization, high yield, and complete genetic control. She saw the Patel heritage wheat not as a precious reserve, but as a dirty, archaic rebellion against the smooth, profitable efficiency she represented. For her, my victory was an existential threat. If one farmer could defy the certified hybrid registry using historical paperwork, the entire multi-billion-dollar framework she helped build would crumble. Reed didn't shout. She didn't panic. She simply pivoted. If she couldn't use the rule designed to protect seed purity, she would use the rule designed to enforce public safety. 2 weeks later, the pristine white Ford Explorer returned, but this time, it was flanked by a heavy, unmarked USDA truck, its side bearing the grim, official lettering, "Quarantine Enforcement." The lead vehicle didn't stop at the porch. It drove straight through the access gate, leaving a deep gash in the mud. Dr. Evelyn Reed was in the driver's seat. She wore sunglasses the size of small shields, obscuring her eyes, but the tightness around her mouth spoke volumes of her barely contained fury. "Mr. Patel," she stated, stepping out. Her voice was sharp, polished, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Your historical exemption is noted. However, the scope of our investigation has now expanded." She motioned to the USDA truck, which was already deploying bright yellow and black tape around the perimeter of my 60 acres. The tape read, "Hazard Zone. Do not enter. Federal quarantine. We are invoking Regulation 37C, Regional Pest Contamination Risk," she announced, flipping open a new, even thicker binder. Based on preliminary findings from our field test on a randomized sample, which, admittedly, we had to destroy, your Desi wheat is highly susceptible to a novel, unclassified fungus which could potentially decimate the neighboring certified hybrid crops. It was a brilliant, malicious lie. A novel, unclassified fungus means nothing and everything. It was a phantom threat, impossible to prove or disprove quickly, giving her maximum leverage. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. The financial siege. The quarantine zone declaration immediately achieved what the fine could not. It choked my farm of capital. The quarantine status meant zero commercial sales. I couldn't harvest or sell a single grain of the Desi Gehun, or any other crop on the land, for the duration of the investigation, which Reed implied could last indefinitely. No federal aid or loans. The quarantine triggered a clause in my existing farm loan agreement, freezing the line of credit. Furthermore, no bank would touch a farm flagged as a hazard zone. Insurance nullification. My crop insurance immediately became void because the damage was attributed to a regulatory action, rather than a natural disaster. This was economic warfare. Reed knew that a small farm like mine operates on razor-thin margins. Without the ability to sell the current harvest or secure the next season's loan, the entire operation would collapse within 6 months, forcing a fire sale of the land. The Desi wheat would be plowed under by the new corporate owner, and the problem would be solved, cleanly, financially, and without the messy complication of old receipts. You know this is baseless, Dr. Reed, I said, walking toward her, trying to maintain my composure. My seed has been grown here for a century. It is resistant to everything local. You are creating a crisis to justify your... Mr. Patel, she interrupted, raising her hand like a stop sign. The USDA does not create crises. We mitigate risks. Your historical document simply granted you an exemption from standardization. It does not grant you immunity from federal biosecurity concerns. The quarantine stands. If you enter, harvest, or attempt to move any material off this land, you will face federal charges and immediate land forfeiture. She gave me one final, cold stare, got back in her Explorer, and drove away, leaving behind the chilling sight of the yellow tape fluttering in the hot afternoon breeze. The search for the cracks. I knew I couldn't fight this alone. My fight had shifted from an archival war to a complex legal and scientific battle. I needed 2 things. Legal muscle that understood the labyrinthine nature of the USDA, and a scientific expert who could debunk Reed's phantom fungus. My first call was to a small, non-profit environmental litigation group based 3 states over, called Ecological Defense. They were hungry, overworked, and specialized in fighting big agriculture's regulatory overreach. Their lead attorney, Lena Sharma, listened to my entire story, the old receipt, the corporate connections, the quarantine, with mounting fury. Mr. Patel, this isn't about fungus, Lena concluded immediately. This is about market control. The timing is too perfect. Your neighbors, the ones growing the subsidized Max Yield 5 hybrid, they're about to face the worst drought in 30 years, and your wheat is the only one standing. You're a liability to their entire corporate marketing strategy. Lena agreed to take the case pro bono, provided I could supply the scientific evidence. That led me to my second, more difficult recruitment, Dr. Alistair Finch. Dr. Finch was a retired USDA soil scientist and agronomist. He had left the department 5 years ago after a bitter fight over the very corporate lobbying that now empowered Reed. He lived a quiet life now, running a small heirloom tomato patch outside Sacramento. He was old school, skeptical, meticulous, and deeply respected in the scientific community. I drove 6 hours just to talk to him. When I laid out the case, Finch remained skeptical, but the phrase non-conforming genetic material sparked something in his eyes. The audacity, he muttered, running a hand over his thick, silver beard. They are turning resilience into a crime. He agreed to look at the soil samples, if I could safely obtain them from the quarantine zone. More importantly, he gave me the critical insight. Arjun, don't look at Reed's fungus. Look at the competition. The reason your Desi wheat is a contamination risk is because its genetic superiority under stress exposes the fraud of their Max Yield 5 hybrid. We need to compare the root structures. The Max Yield 5 is designed for quick growth and massive yield, meaning it sacrifices root depth for top-heavy production. He pulled out an old, hand-drawn diagram from his desk. One root system, long and intricate, reaching deep down. The other, dense but shallow, spreading out horizontally. This is the real war, Arjun, Finch said, tapping the diagram of the deep root. It's not about the fungus on the leaves. It's about the truth under the soil. We need to document that difference, and show the court that when the drought hits, the deep roots of your heritage seed are the only thing that will save the region, and that Reed's actions are deliberately engineering a regional agricultural disaster for corporate profit. I drove home with a plan. Lena would handle the legal and financial tracking of Reed's corporate dealings, and Finch would handle the science. My job, secure the hard evidence, soil, roots, and temperature data from within the federal quarantine. The financial clock was ticking, but now, I had allies, and I knew exactly where to look for the fatal flaw in Reed's defense. Deep beneath the surface, where the Max Yield 5's shallow roots wouldn't reach. The stage was set for the counter-investigation. The midnight dig and the corrupt consultancy. The yellow and black quarantine tape wasn't just plastic. It was a financial noose, tightening daily around the neck of Patel Farm. Every morning, I would wake up to the sight of that federal sign, marking my livelihood as a hazard zone. The irony was a bitter pill. The federal government, sworn to protect American agriculture, was actively engineering the failure of the only healthy crop for the sake of corporate uniformity. The clock that Dr. Reed had set was loud and merciless. In 6 months, the frozen credit line and nullified insurance would force foreclosure. We had to move fast, and we had to move silently. My first task was the infiltration of my own land. The quarantine implied surveillance. While there wasn't a USDA official camped out on the perimeter 24/7, I knew Reed was meticulous. She would have set up trail cameras, perhaps even thermal sensors, to catch any illegal activity, like me harvesting the wheat. But I wasn't going for the grain. I was going for the root. My decades of farming knowledge became my shield. I knew every low point, every dense patch of scrub oak, and every disused drainage culvert on my property. My plan was to enter the quarantine zone from the north end, near the old, seasonal irrigation channel. This channel was overgrown with thick salt cedar, providing excellent cover, and the soil was often damp enough to mask faint footprints, even in the dry season. The sampling had to happen on the darkest night of the lunar cycle, and it had to be done with zero noise and minimal ground disturbance. I needed precise, undisturbed samples of the root systems, not just a scoop of dirt. Dr. Finch had stressed the need for a soil core sampler to extract a cylinder of earth, 3 feet deep, without crushing the delicate root structure. The comparison required 2 critical samples, one from my Desi Gehun field, and one from the neighboring corporate farm, growing the Max Yield 5 hybrid, ideally right on the property line where the soils were identical. The night of the operation was moonless and still. I moved like a ghost, wearing dark, non-reflective clothes and using a silent, hand-pushed wheelbarrow padded with sacks for my tools. I had disabled the power to the few security lights near the main shed years ago, relying instead on my own memory of the land's topography. Reaching the Desi Gehun field was the easy part. The wheat stood tall, a dark, resilient green even in the deepening heat, its leaves rustling softly, a defiant whisper against the quiet night. I selected 3 spots, far from the perimeter. Pushing the core sampler deep into the earth was brutal work, requiring all my strength, but I was motivated by 100 years of history. As I carefully extracted the cylindrical soil sample, I could visually inspect the roots. The Desi Gehun roots were thin, dark, and wiry, descending in intricate vertical networks, reaching down, 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 disappearing far past the 3-foot mark of the sampler. They looked like determined, microscopic steel cables. I carefully sealed the core samples in labeled PVC tubes. The second part, sampling the neighbor's Max Yield 5, was riskier. The corporate farm had high-powered lights, but they relied on volume and uniformity, not subtle security. I crawled across the boundary line. Here, The difference was immediately apparent. The max yield 5, while taller and denser above ground, felt brittle under my touch. When I took the core sample, the effort was minimal. The root mass was thickest in the first 12 inches, forming a dense, tangled net. Below 2 feet, the roots rapidly thinned, and by the 30-inch mark, they were virtually non-existent. These were greedy, shallow roots, designed to gorge on surface water and synthetic fertilizer for fast growth, utterly unprepared for the coming dry heat. It was biological irresponsibility, packaged as progress. Lena's financial counterattack. While I was digging in the dark, my lawyer, Lena Sharma, was busy digging in the databases. She understood that bureaucracy always leaves a paper trail, especially when greed is involved. Arjun, the quarantine is technically legal, but the intent is illegal, Lena told me during a secure, late-night call. We need to show the judge that the regional pest contamination risk is just a smokescreen for unfair business practice and official misconduct. Lena started with Dr. Reed's financial disclosure statements, public record for a federal employee. She found the expected salary and travel expenses, but nestled within the external compensation and consulting section were the smoking guns. She's listed over $300,000 in consulting fees over the last 18 months, Lena explained. The clients are disguised, shell companies and trade organizations, but one trail leads straight back to the AgriGenBio Corporation. AgriGenBio was the behemoth that owned the Max Yield 5 hybrid. They were the primary beneficiaries of the certified hybrid registry, and now, they were paying the USDA official in charge of regulation a massive consulting fee to declare their competitor, my Desi Gehun, a contaminant. This wasn't just a conflict of interest. It was a brazen case of regulatory capture. The dates are critical, Arjun, Lena emphasized. Reed received her largest quarterly payment 2 weeks before she issued your quarantine order. We can argue this whole thing was a paid-for attempt to eliminate a market rival on behalf of AgriGenBio before the drought exposed their product's fundamental weakness. Lena began assembling a legal dossier that was part financial audit, part criminal complaint. Her focus shifted from defending the seed to prosecuting the corruption. The case would no longer be Patel versus USDA, but Patel versus Reed and AgriGenBio. Finch's methodology, quantifying resilience. Meanwhile, I carefully delivered the PVC core samples to Dr. Finch's lab in the dead of night. Finch was thrilled by the quality of the samples. He didn't just want to show the judge the roots. He wanted to prove their quantifiable difference. We need hard numbers, Arjun. Federal judges trust data, Finch lectured, adjusting his thick spectacles. We will use a process called biomass distribution analysis. He explained the methodology. He would meticulously wash the soil from the roots, dry the root mass from each depth layer, 0 to 1 foot, 1 to 2 feet, 2 to 3 feet, and weigh them. My hypothesis is this, Finch explained. The Max Yield 5 sample will have 85% of its total root mass in the top foot, and almost none below 2.5 feet. Your Desi Gehun? It will have a much lower percentage in the top foot, but the weight of the root mass will be almost evenly distributed down to the absolute limit of the 3-foot core, confirming its strategic allocation of energy to deep water seeking. This scientific proof would quantify the inherent drought resilience of my wheat versus the designed fragility of the hybrid. It would prove that the only real risk was the corporate seed's dependence on unsustainable surface water, the very water that was about to vanish. The first signs of despair. As the scientific and legal battles intensified, the physical reality outside our bubble began to change dramatically. The first true heat wave of the summer hit the Central Valley with brutal force. Temperatures soared past 100 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there. I could see the effect from my porch, looking across the barbed wire fence. My neighbor's vast, homogeneous field of Max Yield 5, which had been a vibrant, uniform green, was beginning to stress. The tips of the leaves were curling inward, and a pale, sickening yellow was creeping up from the base of the stalks. They were struggling to pull up water, and their shallow root systems were being starved by the rapidly descending water table. My Desi Gehun, protected by its deep, invisible network, remained a defiant, deep emerald green. The difference was stark and undeniable. Dr. Reed's attempt to financially destroy my farm was now being tragically validated by nature itself. The hybrid seeds were collapsing exactly as they were engineered to do in a severe drought, and my quarantine was ensuring that the only solution, my heritage seed, remained locked away. The urgency was palpable. We had the evidence, the corruption, and the science. Now, we just needed the courtroom, the preliminary injunction, and the data bomb. The courthouse in the regional capital felt worlds away from the dusty quiet of the Patel farm, yet the two were now intrinsically linked by the thin, fragile thread of legal precedent. Outside, the drought was tightening its grip. Inside, the air conditioning whirred in a futile attempt to cool the mounting tension. Our objective was simple but critical: secure a preliminary injunction, a temporary order forcing the USDA to lift the quarantine zone until a full trial could be held. Without this, the financial siege would succeed long before justice could be served. My lawyer, Lena Sharma, was magnificent. She didn't approach the case with the typical timid deference reserved for federal agencies. She was a prosecutor in activist clothing, precise, ruthless, and armed with the financial dossier she had compiled on Dr. Evelyn Reed. Dr. Reed was present, seated at the government's table, flanked by two stone-faced USDA attorneys. She was perfectly manicured, her expression a mask of detached boredom, occasionally consulting a phone as if the proceedings were beneath her attention. She exuded the arrogance of someone who fully expected the system to protect her. Lena opened the argument by addressing the core lie, the regional pest contamination risk. Your Honor, the government alleges a biosecurity threat. We contend that the USDA's quarantine is not based on science, but on financial coercion, designed solely to eliminate a market rival on behalf of its corporate sponsors, Lena declared, her voice ringing clear in the small courtroom. She then produced the evidence from Section 3, the financial trail. We have documentation, Exhibit C, showing that the lead investigator for the USDA, Dr. Evelyn Reed, received a total of $315,000 in consulting fees from a series of shell companies, all traceable back to AgriGenBio Corporation, the very corporate entity that markets the hybrid seed, Maxield 5, which directly competes with Mr. Patel's heritage seed. The largest payment was processed 2 weeks before the quarantine order was issued. This is not regulation. This is regulatory capture. The temperature in the room instantly dropped. Dr. Reed's composure wavered for the first time. Her hand actually trembled as she reached for a glass of water. The lead USDA attorney, Mr. Thompson, immediately launched a furious objection, calling the evidence irrelevant and slanderous. Objection, Your Honor. This is an attempt to malign the character of a federal employee and distract from the true matter, the established risk of genetic contamination. Judge Alvarez, a stern, seasoned woman with a reputation for sharp legal precision, silenced Thompson with a single, slicing gesture of her hand. The integrity of the regulating authority is highly relevant to the validity of the order, counsel. Overruled. Ms. Sharma, proceed to the scientific basis. This was the moment for Dr. Alastair Finch. He was frail but possessed a quiet authority that commanded respect. Finch, speaking as a former USDA agronomist, delivered his testimony with the dry, factual weight of verifiable data. Your Honor, the alleged fungal risk is a moot point, Finch began. The actual risk is the engineered fragility of the surrounding hybrid crops. Our analysis proves that the USDA's current policy, championed by Dr. Reed, is directly leading to regional agricultural collapse in the face of the predicted drought. Finch then presented the results of the biomass distribution analysis derived from the soil cores I had collected at midnight. He used enlarged charts to display the raw data. Chart 1, Maxield 5, hybrid, root distribution. 0 to 1 foot, 86% of total root biomass. 1 to 2 feet, 13% of total root biomass. 2 to 3 feet, 1% of total root biomass. Chart 2, Patel heritage wheat, Desi Gehun, root distribution. 0 to 1 foot, 35% of total root biomass. 1 to 2 feet, 32% of total root biomass. 2 to 3 feet, 33% of total root biomass. The Maxield 5 hybrid, Finch explained calmly, pointing at the shallow bar chart, is genetically engineered to seek only surface resources, prioritizing quick yield over deep water access. This requires constant, massive irrigation, making it utterly non-viable during the ongoing, severe drought. Conversely, the Desi Gehun is engineered by nature and history to distribute its roots evenly, accessing deep, residual soil moisture. The physical evidence is clear. The Desi Gehun is the region's only viable crop right now. The judge leaned forward, intrigued. Finch's data had transformed the case from a niche legal dispute into a matter of public disaster mitigation. Reed's arrogant defense. When it was Dr. Reed's turn to speak, despite her lawyer's desperate warnings, her deep-seated arrogance took over. She felt the need to personally address the uneducated farmer and his discredited former employee. Your Honor, Reed began, standing up sharply, Mr. Patel's data is irrelevant anecdotal evidence. Dr. Finch's methodology is outdated. We are dealing with certified, globally accepted genetic standards. Mr. Patel's seed is a primitive, low-yield variety that threatens the uniformity and therefore the profitability of American agriculture. If we allow every farmer to hoard archaic, uncertified seeds, we invite uncontrolled biological chaos. The USDA's job is to enforce modern efficiency, not sentimentality. His seed is contaminated by its own ancient DNA. Her defense was telling. She didn't deny the consulting fees or the root data. She simply asserted that her version of efficiency superseded all other concerns, including the very survival of the farmers she was supposed to serve. She believed her corporate model was infallible and superior to nature itself. In his rebuttal, Lena brilliantly summarized the conflict. Your Honor, Dr. Reed's defense proves our point. She equates uniformity with purity and views genetic resilience as a threat to profit. Her actions are not agricultural biosecurity. They are an economic act of faith in a failing corporate product. By quarantining Mr. Patel's robust, historically documented seed, the USDA is deliberately ensuring that when the drought kills the shallow-rooted corporate crops, as it is starting to do right now, there will be no viable alternative left. This is sabotage by regulation. Judge Alvarez retired for a short recess. When she returned, her ruling was sharp and decisive. The court finds that the plaintiff, Mr. Patel, has presented sufficient evidence of an immediate, irreparable financial harm and has cast serious, documented doubt on the regulatory intent of the defendant, Dr. Reed. Furthermore, the undisputed scientific evidence presented by Dr. Finch suggests that the quarantine may pose a greater regional risk by suppressing the only crop proven viable during this period of severe drought. She slammed the gavel down. I hereby grant the preliminary injunction. The federal quarantine zone on Patel Farm is to be lifted immediately. The plaintiff is authorized to harvest, sell, and distribute his grain. It was a staggering victory. The financial noose had been cut. But outside the courthouse, the wind was hot and dry, and the true, devastating climax, the judgment of nature itself, was yet to come. Dr. Reed had lost the first legal battle, but her corporate hybrid crops still dominated the valley, and the drought was only intensifying. The Great Drought and the Emerald Island. The preliminary injunction was a legal document, but its true power lay in the timing. Judge Alvarez had cut the financial noose just weeks before the drought, which Dr. Finch had accurately predicted, transformed into a full-scale ecological crisis. As I drove the heavy-duty tractor through the now tattered yellow quarantine tape, it felt less like a farming vehicle and more like a liberation tank. I had the right to work my land, but the land itself was now fighting the most brutal enemy, the relentless, moisture-sucking sun. The heat was a physical presence, a dry, smothering blanket that never lifted, even at night. The air was thick with the scent of dying vegetation and dust. The Central Valley, usually a tapestry of golden grains and fertile soil, was rapidly turning into a monotonous, cracked expanse of ochre and brown. My neighbor's fields, the vast, unbroken monocultures of AgriGenBio's Max-Yield 5 hybrid, were the first to surrender. The hybrid, designed to prioritize rapid, top-heavy growth for high commercial yield, was utterly dependent on constant, deep irrigation. But the regional aquifers were plummeting, and the surface water that Max-Yield 5's shallow, greedy roots relied upon had evaporated into thin air. I drove my truck along the fence line separating my land from the colossal Henderson farm, the largest grower of the max-yield 5 in the county. The difference was heartbreakingly stark. Henderson's field looked like sun-scorched straw. The wheat stalks, which should have been robust, were thin, brittle, and had collapsed entirely in sections, their small, shallow root balls exposed on the cracked earth. The grain heads were shriveled and pale, a total loss. This was the engineered fragility Dr. Finch had described, a spectacular collapse because the seed was designed for corporate profit, not natural endurance. And then, there was the Patel farm. Standing amidst the surrounding agricultural graveyard, my 60 acres of Desi Gehun were a defiant, luminous island of emerald green. The wheat stood strong, its deep roots functioning as designed, methodically drawing up the moisture from the subsoil layers that no other crop in the region could touch. The Desi Gehun had traded yield for survival, and in the face of the great drought, that trade proved invaluable. The visual contrast was a public relations nightmare for Dr. Evelyn Reed and AgriGenBio. Local news helicopters, originally covering the widespread crop failure, began circling my farm. The images they broadcast, a small, vibrant patch of green surrounded by hundreds of thousands of acres of brown, dead corporate crop, told the entire story without a single word of commentary. The non-conforming genetic material was the only thing conforming to the rules of nature. The desperation of the neighbors. The initial reaction from my neighbors, who had previously viewed my traditional methods with mild scorn, was disbelief, quickly followed by desperation. They were commercial farmers, big operators with massive debts tied to the max-yield 5 crop. Total loss meant ruin. My closest neighbor, Mark Henderson, whose family had farmed for 4 generations and who had been particularly vocal about my archaic seeds, arrived at my porch one scorching afternoon. He wasn't in his usual expensive pickup. He drove a beat-up utility vehicle, and he looked defeated. "Arjun, the well is dry," Mark said, his voice husky. "The hybrid is gone. Completely. My loss is over $500,000 this quarter. My bank is already calling. I saw your fields." He couldn't meet my eyes. "How is it still standing? What are you doing different?" I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The sun and the soil had delivered the condemnation. "It's not what I'm doing, Mark. It's what my grandfather did," I replied, simply. "It's the seed. It doesn't need the surface water. It digs deep. It was bred for this. It was bred for survival when the systems fail." Mark swallowed hard, his face a roadmap of financial fear and professional shame. "Do you have any? Any seeds? For next season? I'll pay anything. I'll sign anything." This was the moment of vindication. The very farmers who had benefited from the subsidies and standardization that Dr. Reed enforced, and who saw me as an anachronism, were now begging for the very seeds that Reed had tried to ban as contamination. I looked at Mark, at the desperation of a man about to lose his family's heritage not to drought, but to a bad bet on a genetically inferior product. "I won't sell you the seed, Mark," I said, "but I will lease you a portion of my current harvest. Enough to cover your next season's planting, provided you agree to Dr. Finch's terms for sustainable soil health, not just high yield." Mark didn't hesitate. He grabbed my hand and shook it, the relief overwhelming his pride. "Thank you, Arjun. You saved us." Reed's last, desperate move. The widespread failure of the max-yield 5 hybrid, coupled with the highly public success of the Desi Gehun, created a domino effect. AgriGenBio's stock plummeted, and Dr. Evelyn Reed, the golden girl of standardized agriculture, was now under internal investigation for the failure of her key regulatory initiative. Her response was one final, desperate act of bureaucratic malice. She couldn't touch my land, so she tried to touch my money. She used her remaining authority to initiate a federal audit into the financial viability of Patel Farm, attempting to prove that the preliminary injunction was invalid because I was supposedly insolvent anyway, thanks to the frozen loan. She also filed a motion to subpoena the entire financial record of my attorney, Lena Sharma, clearly intending to scare off the pro bono representation. Lena, however, was prepared. "She's desperate, Arjun. "She's trying to tie us up in administrative hell," Lena said over the phone. But she made a mistake. When she filed the subpoena motion, she filed it under the name of her shell consulting firm, trying to keep the USDA clean. She used her corporate mask in a federal legal proceeding. This was the opening we needed. Lena immediately countered with a filing for contempt of court, arguing that Reed was using her official federal position to conduct a malicious financial attack on the plaintiff using funds secretly supplied by AgriGenBio, thus violating the spirit of Judge Alvarez's previous ruling. It was a direct, aggressive move, designed to remove Reed from the playing field entirely. As the sun set over the Central Valley, bathing my green fields in a warm, triumphant light, I knew the physical battle had been won by the deep roots. The economic disaster Dr. Reed had engineered was now unfolding on the land she sought to protect. But the final, judicial victory, the public destruction of Reed's career and the permanent safeguarding of the Desi Gehun, still lay ahead in the courtroom. The final verdict and the fall of the bureaucrat. The full trial was not about the quarantine anymore. That issue had been settled by Judge Alvarez and, more decisively, by the unforgiving sun. This final hearing, held 6 months after the first confrontation, was a direct legal challenge against Dr. Evelyn Reed and the USDA's fundamental policy of forced uniformity. The atmosphere in the courtroom was charged. Local farmers, media representatives, and even a few concerned Congress staff members had packed the gallery. The failure of the Max Yield 5 had become a national story of corporate hubris versus heritage resilience. Dr. Reed, having lost her legal counsel due to the pending contempt motion and the public relations disaster, now represented herself alongside the overwhelmed USDA public attorney, Mr. Thompson. Her initial composure had cracked, replaced by a brittle, aggressive defensiveness. Lena Sharma, my lawyer, opened the case not with emotion, but with a cold, relentless recitation of facts, meticulously linking Dr. Reed's personal financial gain to the regional agricultural devastation. "Your Honor," Lena began, walking toward the jury box, which was empty, as this was a federal equity case, but the dramatic intent was clear. This case is about the deliberate weaponization of a federal agency for corporate profit. We are not simply arguing against a bad regulation. We are proving a scheme of official misconduct and regulatory extortion. She projected the evidence that had been compiled by Dr. Finch and herself onto the large courtroom screen. Exhibit D. The timeline of deception. June 1st, AgriGenBio stock shows massive insider trading activity, upward trend, anticipating USDA regulatory advantage. June 15th, Dr. Reed receives the largest quarterly payment, $120,000, from the AgriGenBio shell consulting firm. June 29th, Dr. Reed issues the quarantine order against the Patel farm, citing the regional pest contamination risk. August 15th, the great drought peaks. AgriGenBio's Max Yield 5 hybrid fails across the valley, 90% plus crop loss. The Desi Gehun thrives. The purpose of the quarantine was never to protect against an unclassified fungus, which the USDA failed to prove even existed. The purpose was to ensure that when AgriGenBio's inferior, shallow-rooted product inevitably collapsed under predictable environmental conditions, the only viable, drought-resistant alternative, the Patel heritage wheat, would be destroyed, ensuring that AgriGenBio's patents remained the default source for the next planting season, regardless of their performance. Lena then introduced the core scientific evidence one final time, presented by Dr. Finch. Finch had by now completed a meta-analysis, comparing the survival rate of the Desi Gehun across 60 acres to the complete failure of the Max Yield 5 across the adjacent 5,000 acres. He framed the comparison in terms of energy efficiency and resource allocation. "The data is unequivocal," Finch stated, pointing to his charts. "The Desi Gehun utilizes energy for resilience, achieving a survival rate of 98% with minimal water input. The Max Yield 5 utilizes energy for volume, achieving a survival rate of less than 10% under drought conditions. Dr. Reed's regulation protected a genetically inefficient and environmentally reckless product while actively trying to destroy a national genetic reserve." Reed's self-destruction. When it was Dr. Reed's turn for cross-examination, she attempted a highly aggressive defense, trying to dismantle the credibility of both me and Dr. Finch. Mr. Patel is a traditionalist clinging to outdated methods, and Dr. Finch is a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge. Reed sneered, her voice edged with desperation. The consulting fees were for unrelated research into global seed logistics. They have zero bearing on a routine biosecurity decision. But when Lena pressed her on the contempt of court filing, the motion where Reed had used her corporate shell firm's name to launch a financial audit against Lena, Reed snapped. The audit was necessary to prove the financial insolvency of the plaintiff. "You are wasting the court's time with sentimental farming garbage," she exclaimed, slamming her hand on the defense table. Lena, calm and sharp, delivered the final, fatal blow. "Dr. Reed, you are a federal employee. You used your official position to launch a punitive audit against a successful litigant, using funds derived from the competitor's corporation. You admit to the intent to prove Mr. Patel insolvent and therefore overturn the judge's injunction. This is not routine biosecurity. This is an illegal attempt to interfere with a federal court order using the instruments of the USDA, which you abused for personal gain." The judgment of Judge Alvarez. Judge Alvarez, having witnessed the entire spectacle, did not take long to issue her final judgment. Her voice was ice-cold, every word a stone dropping onto Dr. Reed's career. The court finds that the defendant, Dr. Evelyn Reed, has failed to substantiate the claims of pest contamination risk with credible scientific evidence. Conversely, the plaintiff, Mr. Patel, has provided overwhelming, compelling evidence that the quarantine order was motivated by financial conflicts of interest and constituted a deliberate act of regulatory abuse and official misconduct. She then moved to the second point, the financial audit. Furthermore, the defendant's attempt to undermine the preliminary injunction by initiating a retaliatory financial audit, using funds tied to the very corporate entity that stood to gain from the plaintiff's bankruptcy, constitutes a severe and direct contempt of court. The gavel came down with finality, echoing the end of Dr. Reed's career. The ruling, Patel versus USDA. The court permanently invalidates the quarantine order and the fine. The Patel heritage wheat is formally recognized as a protected national genetic reserve strain, exempt from future standardization registries designed for commercial hybrids. Damages. The court awards Mr. Patel $750,000 in damages for lost income, legal fees, and punitive compensation. Contempt. Dr. Evelyn Reed is found guilty of contempt of court and her case is referred to the USDA Office of Inspector General and the Department of Justice for criminal investigation into corruption and abuse of power. Dr. Reed stood frozen, her perfect veneer finally shattering, realizing that her faith in the system's protection had been misplaced. The system had, in the end, devoured its own corrupt agent. Outside, the cheers of the local farmers, led by a newly repentant Mark Henderson, drowned out the sound of the wind. My name was cleared, my farm was safe, and the future of my seeds was secured. The victory felt complete, but the greater work, rebuilding the valley's agriculture, was just beginning. The green revolution of deep roots and lasting legacy. 1 year had passed since Judge Alvarez's gavel dropped, and the Central Valley was a different place. The scars of the great drought were still visible in the cracked, dusty soil of abandoned fields, but where agriculture had survived, it had undergone a quiet, profound revolution. The shift wasn't marked by a sudden technological breakthrough, but by a return to ancient wisdom, working with the land, not dominating it. The most tangible change was the color. The monotonous corporate yellow-brown was replaced by a diverse patchwork of greens and rusts, the deep emerald of the Desi Gehun, the lighter green of cover crops like vetch and clover, and the varying shades of drought-hardy legumes. The valley floor, once brittle and baked, was now slowly becoming permeable again, its surface protected by minimal tillage and rich organic matter. The air smelled of healthy soil and growing things, not just dry heat and synthetic fertilizer. The Patel Heritage and Resilience Act, PHRA, was now fully implemented. AgriGenBio and its corporate rivals were forced to submit their new hybrid strains to rigorous, deep-root stress testing, a requirement that immediately disqualified several of their most profitable, yet environmentally fragile, high-yield varieties. The market for seed was diversifying, tilting away from genetic uniformity and towards ecological resilience. The National Landrace Registry, established under the PHRA, now protected hundreds of heirloom seeds across the country, recognizing genetic diversity as a strategic national asset. My farm, once a quarantine zone, was now a teaching hub. We hosted monthly field days where farmers, young and old, would come to study the Deep Soil Health Initiative methods. The $750,000 in damages had been fully utilized, not just for seed distribution, but for purchasing specialized equipment, like no-till seed drills and sophisticated moisture meters, that were loaned out to any farmer committed to the transition. The fate of the antagonist. The story of Dr. Evelyn Reed, the architect of the chaos, reached its inevitable, grim conclusion. The Department of Justice investigation, fueled by the evidence Lena Sharma provided in court, revealed a pattern of gross official misconduct and a clear exchange of regulatory favors for consulting fees. She was stripped of her credentials, indicted, and eventually served time for federal fraud and regulatory abuse. Her fall was not just a legal victory, it was a powerful signal that the system, though slow and often biased, would not tolerate the deliberate destruction of public trust for private corporate gain. Her legacy was not the standardized max yield 5, which was now seen as a symbol of failure, but the PHRA, which codified the permanent end of her philosophy. The metaphor of the deep root. The true lesson of the conflict, I often reflected, was not about wheat versus hybrid, or farmer versus bureaucrat. It was about the difference between short-term extraction and long-term sustainability. Dr. Reed and AgriGenBio represented the philosophy of the shallow root. Rapid, visible success achieved by aggressively drawing from the surface, easy money, quick yield, and external validation, but with no foundation to withstand predictable stress. Their entire system was built on debt, subsidies, and the false promise of perpetual external resources, water and chemicals. The Desi Gehun, and my grandfather's philosophy, represented the deep root. Slow, steady, quiet investment in the unseen foundation. It was the commitment to the long game, prioritizing resilience and internal strength over external flash. The strength of the seed was not on the surface, but 15 feet below the topsoil, where it could access the truth of the earth. This was the inheritance I fought for. It wasn't the acreage or the harvest. It was the right to pass on a working, adaptable philosophy to the next generation. The Desi Gehun had forced the government to acknowledge that true economic stability lies not in standardization imposed from Washington, but in diversity nurtured in the soil. The quiet future. On a warm afternoon, I walked through the fields with Mark Henderson and my own young nephew, who had recently decided to study soil science. The air was buzzing with the sound of bees, and the wheat stood tall and healthy. "You know, Arjun," Mark said, gesturing toward his own thriving land. "When the government sent that quarantine tape, I saw ruin. You saw an opportunity to show them the truth." I smiled, picking up a handful of the rich, dark soil. The soil that was now capable of holding moisture for weeks. "They tried to pave over the creek of our history, Mark. But the water always finds a way. And the deep roots always remember where the water is buried." The sun was setting, not as a harsh spotlight, but as a warm, comforting glow. The Patel farm had become the living proof that the most valuable treasure on this earth is not the gold we dig up, nor the chemicals we synthesize, but the quiet, deep wisdom that generations of farmers have entrusted to the seed itself. My fight was over, but the era of deep roots had just begun.